So good morning. Welcome to our webinar this morning, where we'll be discussing Britain in 2023 and what the year ahead in politics might look like. My name's Janie Emerson and I'm the managing partner at Hanson Search across the UK and Europe. For those of you that don't already know us, Hanson Search is a specialist headhunting business that focuses on communications, marketing and public affairs. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by a fantastic panel who I will introduce you to in just a moment. So we'd like today's session to be as interactive as possible. So please do get involved. Type questions into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen as we're going along. I'll try and answer some of those during the initial discussion, but towards the end, we'll have some time to run through as many questions as we can. So let me introduce you to our panel today. So I'm joined by Emma Norris, Deputy Director at the Institute of Government. Emma has oversight of the organisation's research programme and leads work on strategy, audience and impact. Emma has extensive experience of public policy right across Whitehall and Westminster. I'm also joined by Anita Boateng, partner at Portland Communications. Anita previously worked at the highest levels of government as a special advisor in the Cabinet Office, the Ministry of Justice and DWP. And also Jim Bligh, Director of Public Affairs for the UK and Ireland at PepsiCo. Jim currently represents some of the UK's best loved brands and previously was Corporate Affairs Director at Tata Consulting Services, Head of Policy at the CBI and a Visiting Fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute. So this is the fourth year now that we've run this webinar looking at the year ahead in politics and what it may bring. When we held it last January, Sue Gray's report was about to be published that day, I think. Boris's future looked very uncertain and the cost of living was really starting to take hold. So the first question that I'd like to ask our panelists is, how do you think the government will tackle the year ahead? It's obviously a critical year for the Conservatives as the next election looms closer and we don't know when that might be. But we talked last year in the webinar about how COVID had been really crippling the government in terms of taking action. Do we think that's now improved and what areas can they address to regain public confidence and deliver on the manifesto? So Emma, could I start with you on this one?
Of course. Hi Janie, thanks for having me here. So I think in thinking about what the government and Sunak need to tackle this year, it's first important to kind of step back and look at the incredible conditions in which Sunak took on the role of Prime Minister. He was the third Prime Minister in the space of a year. Last year, there were 37 ministerial resignations, 66 cabinet appointments, the death of the Queen, war in Europe. You've mentioned the cost of living crisis. So I think Sunak's immediate task this year has been to return a sense of stability to the country. And I think, to an extent, he has achieved that already. Things feel a little bit calmer than they did at the worst points of last year, but obviously the situation is still really tough. There remains a sense of crisis in the cost of living, the strikes that I'm sure we're going to talk about this morning, and then, a kind of continuing mess on ethics and standards, which is starting to bubble up again. I think in terms of where government itself is at, I don't think that it is quite as affected by the pandemic, at least in central government, as it was last time that you were talking. But I think that this year the government is struggling to deliver for different reasons. Yesterday at IFG, we published our Whitehall Monitor report, which is our annual look at the kind of state of Whitehall and looks at some of the kind of key stats, and they're really sobering. There are serious workforce issues in the civil service, crashing morale, absolutely enormous levels of turnover in departments, people leaving roles, leaving government altogether. And of course, departmental budgets are just so tight and are going to continue to be so, and that's going to make workforce problems even more difficult. So, that picture of government is not one energized and kind of ready to deliver, but one already under a lot of strain. I think in terms of what Sunak should focus on now and what the government should focus on now, look, I think Sunak's start of the year speech made it quite clear that he's not going to aim to deliver the whole manifesto or anything like it. He's decided to narrow down his government's 5 priorities to, halving inflation, growing the economy, reducing national debt and waiting lists in the NHS, and then the small boats promise, of which we're going to see more legislation soon. I think it's smart actually to focus in on a few priorities that might be deliverable by the election rather than overpromise. So that is sensible. I think the question is, do the priorities that Sunak has set out match what the public think the priorities should be at the moment? And I think it's striking that there was almost nothing about strikes in there. They're dominating people's lives at the moment. There were few ideas about how to resolve the immediate crisis in the NHS, which is, connected to backlogs, but actually isn't just about that. The unaffordable cost of energy is going to come roaring right back up the political agenda in the spring, or as soon as government clarifies what kind of ongoing support mechanisms look like. So there's lots there that I don't think has quite been captured in those 5 promises that needs to be, if the public are going to be convinced that this is a government that really understands what they need to be delivered between now and the general election. And then I'll be quiet after this, but I think the one other thing that the public might expect Sunak to start tackling is this hangover on ethical standards. You said that this time last year, the Gray report was just about to come out. Well, one of the promises that Sunak made was that he was going to deliver a government of integrity. But, in the last few weeks alone, we've seen, kind of new, or at least old scandals coming back on Zahawi, more emerging about Dominic Raab, the deputy PM. It does feel like there's a bit of a kind of pattern emerging of a prime minister who isn't acting as quickly or decisively as you might expect if integrity is top of the agenda.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. Anita, can I get your thoughts? You're still on mute, Anita.
Gosh, that age-old problem, rearing its head again. I think that there's probably sort of 3 categories of problem that Sunak needs to fix. And I think that, Emma, I think you kind of very neatly elucidated the problem within the machinery of government around the kind of practicalities of actually governing when you have a lot of legislation, lots of departments like DCMS, for instance, who aren't used to shepherding this amount of legislation and not a lot of time to do it. But I think there's that problem. There is a kind of political problem of his backbenchers and managing and creating a cohesive parliamentary party. And then there's a problem of how do you actually win an election? And I think that 1 has been covered, but 2 and 3 are actually in tension with one another. So when you look at the kind of why are we in a situation where Sunak is effectively planning to under-promise and over-deliver when it comes to those 5 pledges, as Emma says, they're not necessarily the things that are top of mind for the electorate when you think about some of the immediate challenges that Britain faces. And part of that is about creating a sense of priorities that the entire parliamentary party can unite around, because it's very difficult to get back onto the front foot of illuminating your sort of broader vision for the country if your party behind you is sort of holding knives behind their backs. And so I think it is very difficult for Sunak to both create a political programme that all of the party supports and also create a political programme that would win you an election. So one of the problems that he has is on some of those other issues, like, for instance, NHS spending, the party is in a place right now where it wants lower taxes and increased spending. And there is sort of no way to get around that. The party wants growth, but doesn't want planning reform and some of the trickier things that you might do, maybe higher immigration, that would allow you to deliver the kinds of growth that would make a tangible difference in such a short period of time. So I think that he is definitely making, and the government's plan is this sort of under promise, over deliver, keep these 5 pledges and exceed them. And I think that is plausible. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of them and some of the most important ones in this discussion. But the secondary question of how do you get to a position where you are competitive for an election, which is also going to make a difference to your party unity, that is more challenging and probably requires you to slightly run against your party, right? To make the point about integrity, professionalism and accountability, and therefore to throw some of your MPs and ministers under the bus if they fall short of that. For you to say, well, actually, we are going to draw a line on the question of economic competence, and therefore I'm going to rule out at this moment tax cuts because I don't think they're affordable. And that kind of thing may help Sunak's ratings. It may drag up the Conservative Party's ratings, but the parliamentary party probably won't stand for it. So it's useful to think about Sunak in some ways as sort of like a coalition leader, right? Keeping this thing together and keeping the show on the road and hoping for a couple of breaks that allows him to close that gap, and that will, once he's got that momentum, it will allow the Conservatives to be competitive in the next election. So there are a lot of landmines right now. He's doing what's sensible, but will only get you so far.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anita. Jim, can we get your thoughts?
Thanks. I think, Anita, you covered the political areas incredibly well, and I think it feels all a bit mid-90s, I think, for the Conservative Party at the moment, but there is a critical difference, and that is by the mid-90s, despite all the sleaze and all of the challenges the major government faced, they had several decent years of economic growth, and I think that is one of the critical challenges for the government this year. Obviously, we saw the IMF forecast for the G7 countries, which put Britain right at the bottom in negative economic growth territory. Whether we buy that or not is another question. I think some of that's up for debate. I suspect the economy is slightly more robust than it looks, and we saw that with the November GDP figures. But there are some clear headwinds. In the short term, you've got energy, Ukraine, industrial relations, inflation, and the cost of living. And obviously, they've got to be able to tackle that. But we've also got some really persistent long-term economic problems that unless we're tackling those and setting out serious plans to do so, the British economy will not become competitive again with the economies that we're really competing with. Britain is competing with European countries, let's be absolutely clear. And you see there a degree of regulatory stability in particular, and economic stability that suggests as a long-term thought. Now, that doesn't, I think, appear to be the case with the UK government right now. I think if you look at productivity, we've had historically and persistently low productivity in the economy, far below the leaders of the G7. Yeah, we're doing slightly better than Canada, slightly better than Japan, but our big competitors, those European nations in the G7 and the US, are doing substantially better than Britain on productivity. And unless we improve that, I think there are real challenges in the long term. And I think then the labour market is another issue. You know, the government is clearly alarmed by the over 50s exodus from the labour market. They say that around 500,000 people have left the labour market in that bracket. I think it's also really clear that there are quite a lot of women in particular who are leaving the labour market, particularly because childcare is so incredibly expensive. What is the point in working for some people when childcare costs what it costs? So you've got some structural long-term issues in the labour market as well. But meanwhile, businesses are facing huge labour shortages. There are thousands of vacancies across lots of different industries in all areas of the economy and all areas of the UK. What's the answer to that? It's really difficult to know. But what's clear is we need some long-term thinking on skills, thinking about immigration and how that can work. And that's really difficult for the Conservative Party, given where it's painted itself, but it has to be part of the solution. And also long-term investment. Is there a decent plan for transport infrastructure, digital and so on that will help improve that productivity going on? If you look at our big cities in the UK, productivity is low and labour market performance is poor, in part because of that underinvestment in transport links, and in part because of underinvestment in childcare. So if we can help tackle those structural issues, then the government can at least go into the next election and say, look, we get the long-term problem, we're tackling the persistency element of it, and look, we're making some progress. But I think unless they do that, it's going to be really difficult to demonstrate that they get the challenge that the people are facing in the UK right now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jim. So a couple of you've touched on it already, but I didn't think we could talk today without talking about the record high levels of industrial action that we're seeing at the moment, from trained staff to nurses, and then obviously teachers for the first time yesterday, and civil servants. So how do you think the government can get on top of this ever increasing level whilst obviously protecting the public finances? So Anita, can I come to you first on that one?
Oh, wonderful. See, this is an interesting one because we were talking earlier this week, weren't we? And I was thinking about strikes and sort of finding it hard to imagine this being the state of the nation for the entire year. And yet, the more you think about it, the more you wonder whether there's a real path out of it. And I think that the problem that both sides, and by both sides, I'm going to say the government, even though the government isn't responsible or the lead partner in some of these strike negotiations, is that sort of both sides think the public are on their side and think they can win the argument in public opinion, and therefore that the other side will get exhausted. And as we remember from the Brexit impasse days, there is always going to be a contingent of the public that support you, but if you keep believing that it's winnable, you hold out and don't necessarily compromise. So I think I am quite pessimistic about the ability to navigate through these different strikes, especially because the reality of the challenge is that every single one of these sectors has a very different set of problems, and yet the worry that the government or even some of the businesses that are negotiating, for instance, with train drivers, is that sort of example effect. So one deal with the nurses is not going to revolutionize our inflationary outlook. But if the government settles for a certain amount with the nurses, there is this fear that then every single other ask gets pegged to what the nurses got. And so you do end up in aggregate in a situation that is inflationary. And I think fundamentally, the government can't really afford this. It cannot afford to spend the levels of the little amount that it has when it needs to invest in things like recovery in schools, for instance, or in the NHS, on pay itself. Yet the problem with recruitment and retention is so acute that there has to be some way to break the impasse. I'm not going to reach a very good conclusion, or indeed a conclusion, on this panel, because I think that it's going to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. The thing I will say that makes me feel more optimistic than perhaps I sound is that I think that Sunak has instructed his ministers to take the air out of the balloon. I think they are definitely not seeing this as a vote winner, and they are looking for ways to kind of neutralize the problem. And I think that has taken some of the acidity out of the conversation. So I sort of think that there might be a way in which, if the government can turn the conversation from the existing pay round to the future pay round and show a great deal more flexibility in that, we might reach an impasse. But I think that the public isn't on both sides. And I think that the more this continues, the more the government suffers from the broader perception that sort of Britain isn't functioning as it should.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Anita. Jim, can I come to you to get your thoughts?
I think it's really difficult, and I agree with Anita that there's kind of a long-term kind of view of this, that can this really go on all year? Yeah, it probably can, actually. I mean, you look at some of those who balloted but haven't yet gone on strike, and I'm thinking of junior doctors in particular. There's more that could come down the line that could cause some real difficulties for the government, and obviously that has an impact on business and how we go about doing our, conducting our business and so on. That's really, really tricky. I think what this shows is that over a long term, as a government, you've got to treat your employees in an appropriate way, and that means not just cutting pay, salami slicing pay every single year, and not increasing pay with inflation, because what that leads to is this kind of intractable difficulty with long-term industrial relations issues. And I think it will take a really long time to recover, for government to recover as an employer and recover the trust of their employees. So that's tricky. I think the lesson for the next government is that they do need to make sure there is some decent decent pay increases, some decent thought about what happens in terms of conditions on the front line, particularly in the health service. And again, if they can't grasp that longer term challenge, then I think they're not going to be able to solve these problems in the shorter term as well. I think just on the costs, I think the nurses, the volume of nurses and the amount that they're looking for in terms of a pay increase, I don't think that would have a huge inflationary effect. But what it does do is it sets a pattern for the other disputes in the across all other sectors. So I think government's got to be just really careful. And a lot of this is about how it times and sequences deals that it ultimately will have to make in a way that kind of minimizes the impact on inflation. But I don't think there's any easy answers to this. It has a kind of a Jarndyce and Jarndyce feel to it, that this will kind of run on for another period of time. And obviously some of that is political from the trade unions as well. So will this run to a general election? I strongly expect it will.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Emma.
I mean, I completely agree with what Anita and Jim have already said. I think on Jim's point, the long-term view and this being, a kind of long-term industrial relations issue, that's exactly right. The main issue driving this pay levels is something that's deep-rooted. Since 2010, public sector pay has fallen by about 6% in real terms. And I think, the impact of that situation has been really clear for some time. There have been enormous problems with recruitment, retention, morale of staff in public services for years now. It's been made more acute by the pandemic, but it was a trend that was already there. I think that the key thing that matters to the public is that public sector pay is not at a level where it can sustain a kind of minimum standard of service delivery, if you like. When you have 50,000 staff leaving the workforce last year in the NHS, or 10% of roles being vacant by last September, that's not sustainable. There's got to be something done if you're going to be able to provide a kind of minimum service standard. I think, government's response is to try and legislate its way out of industrial action, introducing the minimum service levels idea. But I don't think, the big picture is government can't legislate its way out of its recruitment and retention problems. If staff don't feel they're paid enough and their ability to strike is limited, then I would expect they will just withdraw their labour in other ways, perhaps by resigning or choosing not to take those roles in the first place, which then further feeds into the problematic cycle of recruitment and retention problems. So I think in the end, government is going to have to revisit pay offers. And, as the others have said, I think we're already starting to see a kind of softening of language there. And it's noticeable that the one strike action that has been resolved, that of criminal barristers, did so following an improved pay offer. I think the really big question is, when those pay offers come, where is the money going to come from? The Treasury and Number 10 have said that increased pay officers are going to have to be paid out of existing budgets. That will be a nightmare for public services. NHS England have already said in their evidence to the pay review body that if they have to fund higher wages with no extra money from government, it's going to make public service performance even more difficult, and that doesn't feel sustainable either. So a very difficult situation that I think, as Anita and Jim have said, is likely to run on for some time yet, but I'm pretty sure will ultimately result in higher pay offers.
Thank you, Emma. Well, that brings us on quite nicely to my next question around the cost of living crisis. As it continues to escalate, and as you mentioned, Emma, Rishi Sunak outlined his 5 promises in his speech in January, and one of which was to halve inflation this year. So what do you think to the government's approach so far? And I guess everything we've been talking about with industrial action will tie into this. But what else, could or should the government be doing to combat the spiralling costs? Jim, can we start with you this time?
Yeah, I think some of this it's out of the government's hands. We saw with the Ukraine headwinds, with the inflationary impact of oil and gas going up, but also a whole load of other things as well. If you think of kind of food supply, if you think of kind of oils and so on that have an impact on costs here in the UK, all of those costs have increased everywhere from wherever they're from. So I think that is a real challenge, but some of it is out of government's hands in terms of what they can actually do. I think one of the things that the government, can meaningfully do here is think about regulation and think about the burden of regulation on businesses in particular, and particularly those sectors where they're concerned about the impact of cost of living. Now, not all inflation will impact individual households' cost of living, but I'll tell you what will, that's massively increased food prices. So government, my view, needs to look very, very, very closely at the regulations it's bringing in, and particularly on food, and thinking about packaging in particular, making sure that it's not burdening food manufacturers with very large amounts of extra taxes for no real return for using, for example, plastic through their extended producer responsibility policies. Now, it sounds relatively minor, but if you look at all of the different regulatory burdens that are kind of accumulating on businesses in lots of different sectors, that's driving up costs. It's driving up employment costs, it's driving up input costs, it's driving up output costs. Now, that all feeds into a substantially higher inflation figure than we'll be comfortable with. Government, I think, needs to be a bit smarter about regulating, needs to push off some of the more expensive issues that it's got on its plate at the moment for another couple of years until businesses find it more affordable to absorb some of those costs. But right now is not the time to be increasing it. And I think the other thing I'd say is that later this year, the government's looking at EU rules and about the 50% of UK legislation, or so I'm sure Emma can tell me actually what it actually is, looking at 4,000 rules to work out what can stay and what can go and what needs to be reviewed. What all that's going to lead to is a greater element of uncertainty about the regulatory environment in the UK, and in all likelihood will also lead to increased costs on businesses. Now is not the time to be increasing costs, so government needs to be extremely sharp about how it's dealing with that and understanding the impacts on inflation, or it risks just letting it go out of control again. So I'm being quite specific on the regulation point. I know there's quite a lot of other burdens as well, but the cumulative regulatory burden is enormous, and it's also quite unstable and unpredictable. So it's quite important that government deals with that as part of its promise.
Great, thank you, Jim. Emma, can we get your thoughts next?
Sure. So I think, look, on the inflation pledge, in some ways it's quite an easy political pledge to make. The OBR and the Bank of England central forecasts have already suggested that it will be met, and that doesn't have much to do with government policy. It's more to do with other real world factors, as Jim has said, what's happening to energy supply and demand, post-pandemic bottlenecks, Bank of England policy. But I think by the same token, to be fair to the Prime Minister, there isn't a huge amount that he can do if other factors conspire to prove the current forecasts wrong. There is a lot of uncertainty about the kind of bigger macro picture, which will have the biggest impact on which direction inflation goes in. I think on the approach so far, one of the points at least I'd make is that I am a bit sceptical about the constant emphasis on the need to worry about the inflationary effects of public sector pay. I think it's a bit overdone personally. Yes, at some point you could end up in a wage price spiral where prices increase as a result of higher wages and so on and so on. But the mechanism for public pay to really feed through to market prices is actually quite convoluted. And I think even after a better pay settlement, public sector pay is very clearly not going to be leading inflation. It's falling behind it. I think there are other things government can look at. I mean, Jim talked about regulation, and I think that's exactly right. The EU retained law bill we need to be very careful here and try and create as much regulatory certainty as possible. And so, that has to be the priority approaching that piece of legislation. I think government's also going to want to look further at green policies, home insulation, creating warmer homes, lowering bills, a kind of solid route to greater energy security. So there's lots they can do, but the kind of bigger macro picture is something that they don't have as much control over as they would like to, and that's the same for most countries.
Great, thank you, Emma. Anita.
So the broad picture is absolutely right that regulation has the ability to possibly derail some of these broader efforts on growth, and also that the government isn't really responsible for keeping inflation low and stable. And Emma's outlined kind of where we expect inflation to go this year. So it could be, you're predicting the weather will be warmer in June, right? It's probably going in that direction. But the thing that the government does have to worry about in terms of inflation and cost of living, there's sort of two elements, I'd say, actually. The first is that most people have experienced inflation in a context in which they literally couldn't really afford how they were living. And so even if inflation comes down, that's just the rate of increase in prices. There's no world in which deflation is going to happen. And so for a lot of people, even if the government does reach its target and inflation stops going at the current rate, in terms of what people might experience in the shops, it's going to be not dissimilar to right now, where my coffee was £1, it's now £1.50. Okay, it's going to £1.55. That's still not affordable from where it was that I remember a year and a half ago, which was £1. So I think that even if inflation starts to decrease, will that come through to people feeling richer? Not necessarily. And if wages, forget public sector wages, but even private sector wages do not go up at a significant tick, then I think that you might be in a situation where people don't necessarily feel better off. So there's that. And the second thing, I think there's a bit of a perception in Westminster, certainly, that the economy is going in a positive direction. You've got kind of COVID recovering, you've got a milder winter than expected. Could we get into a situation where the economy starts to look good? But I think the point that we made earlier about the IMF forecast, I thought was really, really interesting. A 1% downward revision when global conditions have gotten better is quite a big moment for the UK. And no one knows. I mean, these forecasts, they do their best, but there's lots of other spanners that can be put into the works. But when we think about the fact that the labour market in the UK is a particularly unique challenge in that we don't really have enough workers. That does mean that the market is tighter than it is in a lot of other countries. And then you add to that, interest rates are just going up, energy prices are, being felt more acutely. That's a combination of three that's not actually seen in a lot of other countries. So the government's political strategy is broadly play for time. Something could turn up, the economy could start to turn a corner, and then you're sort of in the territory of the economy is going gangbusters, don't let Labour mess it up. And I think that that's not necessarily guaranteed. And there are some significant challenges in the economy that actually are kind of creating a cocktail that other countries aren't going to experience. That could mean that even if inflation technically halves, people, first of all, don't feel better off. And also there are other barriers in the economy.
Great, thank you, Anita. So final question from me before we move to questions from our audience. So if you do have something you'd like to ask the panel, please do pop it in the Q&A box and I'll talk through those in a moment. So last question from me, with Labour leading the polls, obviously they have a great opportunity to regain a majority in the next election. What do you think Labour need to focus on to make that a reality? And which other parties do you think we need to be watching for potential seat gains? Emma, do you want to kick us off this time?
Yeah, sure. So look, I think one of the most critical things that Labour needs and that any political party needs when they're heading for an election is, a very clear vision and set of priorities. And I think Starmer started to do that in his kind of kick off the year speech, where he, kind of emphasised focusing on unleashing untapped potential, decentralising power, renewing public services. And I think on some issues, we're starting to see deeper policy development. So the Brown Commission sketched out in a bit more detail what that decentralisation of power might look like. I think right now, Labour are going to want to focus on developing their policy offer in other key areas. So they've obviously had a strong emphasis on NHS reform, childcare, and so on. And I think one of the areas that opposition parties grapple with is how much detail should they go into on the policy development whilst they're still in opposition. On the one hand, they want to develop a really clear sense of what they're offering. You've got to start moving towards being a party that can offer solutions rather than just describe problems. On the other hand, too much inflexibility can be a real problem when your policies meet reality. That's something that Ian Duncan Smith found when trying to push ahead with universal credit, something that he developed, lots of detail in opposition, but when he entered government, it ended up being incredibly problematic. So I think Labour are going to want to develop detailed policy, but also there's a bit of flexibility that's needed there. I think obviously the most important thing for any political party is to focus on campaigning. Plans don't mean anything if you don't win. But I know that one of the areas that Labour is rightly focusing on is preparation for the actual transition into government too. An election could come at any time, really. We're expecting it to be towards the end of next year, but in the current political world, who knows? And I think making sure that if it happens and Labour do go into government, it goes as smoothly as possible will enable them to act kind of quickly and effectively. And it's really important to remember that almost none of the shadow team, with just a few exceptions, have experience in ministerial roles in government. So really preparing for the transition is important. And the kind of things I'd expect them to be focusing on are preparing for access talks. Sometime in the kind of 6 to 12 months before an election, Labour will be granted a kind of official contact with permanent secretaries and with the civil service to understand what's happening in government more and to start talking through their policy priorities. I'd expect them to focus on policy sequencing. So what are the most important priorities that they want to move on quickly in government? What does that mean for a First King's speech? What does that mean for legislation? And I'd expect them to focus on understanding the roles. Literally, what does being a Secretary of State mean? What is the current state of departments? And really ensuring that the shadow teams understand that. And then this is a very Institute for Government point, but thinking through how they want to organise the government itself. The centre of government, number 10, Cabinet Office, the Treasury, has been pretty dysfunctional in recent years. So really thinking through what are the machinery changes they might need to try and deliver on their vision, and how are they going to implement them.
Great, thank you, Emma. Anita.
So I am not going to prosecute the argument, even as a former Tory special advisor, that Labour is not odds on to win the election. But I do think I'm slightly sceptical at this point that we are in a 1997 moment, right? I think that Labour's approach, for instance, has been very defensive. You're not going to catch us talking about, taxes. You're not going to catch us being soft on immigration. You're not going to catch us saying Brexit's been a danger to the economy. But I think the mountain they have to climb electorally is significant, right? The worst election result for Labour since 1935, less than a third of votes cast, all of the way they went backwards in Scotland and in Wales. And I think that Keir Starmer's approval ratings right now are better than Sunak's, but nowhere near where Blair's were in 1996, right? So I think that, and they also don't have the option of just saying, the big challenge we have is the reassurance piece, particularly on tax and spend. And they can't just go, by the way, as Blair did, we're going to stick to Tory plans for tax and spend, because I don't even think the Tories can stick to the Tory plans for tax and spend after the election. So in reality, they have this defensive strategy when they're 20 points ahead, and they are not giving that sort of proactive reason to vote for people, to get votes from people. And at the same time, I'm not convinced that they are adequately and fully lancing the boil around tax and spend. So, and there is a risk around tax and spend that tax rises are popular right now, and they're always kind of popular theoretically, but are they in reality? And will a Labour Party going into an election saying, by the way, we're going to need higher taxes in order to invest in public spending, going to reignite some of that anxiety around Labour and its approach to spending, especially because they lack this kind of broader vision and a really tangible sense from the electorate about who Keir is and a real attachment to Keir Starmer as a future leader. So I think that Labour has to sort of take risks. I've always thought that Keir Starmer is the most risk averse and in some ways a kind of least sort of politically bold leader that they had in quite a long time. And there is no better moment to do it than now. And I think that Labour is doing, I think my sense of what's happening behind the scenes in the Labour Party is they're doing quite a lot of like fake reg boxes and having former, civil servants come in and speak to them about how they govern. Of course, that's not the serious work that needs to happen when it comes to preparing for government. But I wonder if it needs to be less of a managerial approach and more of this kind of a few big, bold swings that allows you to tackle that thing that's coming through in some of the focus groups that Portland runs, for instance, that like it's a bit sort of, he kind of just says the government's wrong. It's like, it's kind of commentariat behavior a lot of the time. And so what are the things that, does Keir Starmer just get his ideas from focus groups? Like, what does he believe? What does he stand for? And I think that Labour has the room right now to be able to do that and take some bigger swings. And I think that I think that the Labour Party, of course, are odds on to win, but they are talking about winning a majority here, achieving a swing that actually exceeds Tony Blair's in order to really functionally govern. And I think that that's actually quite a high bar, and they need to be doing more than they're doing right now.
Great, thank you, Anita. Jim.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think it's a really, really difficult mountain, a difficult task for Keir Starmer. I think it's pretty clear that there's fairly firm opposition to the government, but that doesn't necessarily equate to firm support for Labour. And I think if you look at the polls closely and you look at people's feelings about Keir Starmer, he's not Tony Blair, is he, in terms of popularity, and it doesn't feel the same. And it does feel like he has a very big challenge if he's not going to win significant numbers of seats in Scotland. So I'd watch, one of the questions you asked Janie was about other parties and who we need to watch for seat gains. I think we need to watch what happens to the SNP really closely. If Nicola Sturgeon is running that election again, or even if she's not, what does that mean, and how many seats will Labour get in Scotland? I think it's really hard to see them winning an overall majority, particularly a chunky one, if they don't take those seats in Scotland that they lost, several elections ago now, it seems. I think that the one thing that, for me, with Labour at the moment that is quite impressive is that they're trying really hard to engage with businesses. They want to tell us that they're listening to us. They want to tell us that they've got all these great ideas, and that we have this flexibility and opportunity to be able to submit our ideas to them, their manifesto as well. And it's really welcome. It's a really different change of tone from where they were under Jeremy Corbyn. But what I would say is that at the moment that's not translating into kind of a public debate about what their ideas are. I'm not really seeing the ideas for how we get the economy back to growth, how we tackle those persistent labour market and productivity issues, what we're going to do about long-term challenges like net zero and getting the public finances back in order. And at the moment they're talking about a sovereign wealth fund, reforming the apprenticeship levy, but there's not that much else. So I'm looking forward to seeing the fruits of this engagement turn into real policy opportunities. But I think given the tone and the way that they've gone about engaging, businesses can be fairly optimistic that Labour will be listening to them over the next year or so. But the challenge that they've got, the electoral challenge, shouldn't be underestimated.
Great, thank you all. So let's move on to some questions from our audience then. So question here about the local elections. Where do you think the big local election battlegrounds will be in May? And what do you expect to see? Will a bad set of results tip the government into another round of infighting, do you think? Does anyone want to start us off on that one? Can I come to you, Jim?
I'm not sure I can do the local elections point, apart from I think it's obviously not looking great for the government. But what I would say is that that's going to be a turning point in the year for the Conservative Party, and we've seen with the Conservative I think it's democratic organisation, is it, which feels a bit momentum in the Tory party. And with Boris Johnson doing his interview with Nadine Dorries on Friday and all that stuff, you can see some of that kind of opposition internally building up. And I just wonder what's going to happen after, say there's a terrible performance for the government in May in the locals, whether we're going to see another summer of challenges and leadership rumbles and all the rest of it. Couldn't come at a worse time for government as they try and actually govern. But you can see that as being a turning point in the year. If the government kind of holds out at a reasonable level and it's not too disastrous, or if the Labour Party underperform against expectations, then that also presents an opportunity for CNAC to say, look, we're on track, we can do okay, we're not necessarily going to lose the general. But that doesn't feel that likely looking at the polls at this stage.
A quick thing for me, just to say that I think that 2019 was a tough year for the Conservatives, and there aren't that many all-out, so sort of all seats up for grabs this time. But some of the interesting battlegrounds that were it's always Peterborough, right, which was the 2019 one. I was special advisor to the party chairman that year, so I remember this year pretty well, unfortunately. And I think things like Stoke-on-Trent, Derby, those kinds of areas where Labour were sort of doing pretty well, and whether they can continue that momentum and maybe get control of some of those could be very interesting. I think of locals as being a kind of slight snapshot of making sure the polls are sort of roughly correct. I'm not sure they have that predictive element. I'm not convinced they will be a huge destabilising moment for the party, just because I think that there is a lack of appetite for any significant leadership wranglings. So maybe that's my slight optimistic note. But I think that you would expect Labour 20 points ahead to be reflected very, very strongly in those, and to give that party certainly a boost coming into the summer.
Great,
and
thank
also
you.
I should say that Portland do a very good analysis of local elections. So if you want advice on that and other things around the elections, let us know.
Thanks, Anita. Emma, anything to
I
add?
completely agree with Anita that I think what will be most interesting about the locals is this is a real snapshot for us to understand, are the polls broadly correct in practice? Are we seeing what we'd expect there? I think on the Labour side, we've been hearing about a potential reshuffle in the shadow cabinet for a while now. And I think that might come after the local elections. I think it would probably make sense for Labour to kind of hang on until that point and then think about, looking ahead to the general election, who do they want kind of in key posts? So it will be interesting to see post-election what happens there, and if the shadow reshuffle finally takes place.
Great, thank you. So we've had a couple of questions in about the Lib Dems. So what do the panel think in terms of Lib Dems? Do they present a threat to either of the two main political parties, and how do you think they may fare in the next election? Don't know who wants to kick us off on that one. Anita?
One quick thought is that the Lib Dems, it's been slightly disguised, as it always is in between elections, but the Greens have been really gaining ground on the Lib Dems in some significant places, in some significant ways, especially because the salience of climate change. It's come through in council elections, and if you guys aren't as nerdy as me and don't watch those, it's not sort of reflected in general. Some election shares, actually, the Greens have gained ground, and I think some of that has been to the detriment of the Lib Dems. In general elections, the Lib Dems get helped by the fact that they're huge and the fact that they're contesting Tory seats. And I think that we will see, an impressive, relatively speaking, showing from the Lib Dems at the next election, if the current polls sort of hold. Are they going to become more politically relevant? I'm less convinced of that. I think they are back to the situation of being a kind of protesty vote. They're not kind of associated, certainly, with the coalition government. And also, I think that the anti-conservative alliance is stronger than it has been in a significant period of time. And the reality of that just means that there are many more options for the Lib Dems to grab the seat from the nose of the Conservatives. So it's not going to be because of the Liberal Democrat prospectus, so to speak, but I think there is a real chance that because that anti-Tory alignment, and that is very much helped, for instance, by the fact that Keir Starmer is not nearly as toxic as Jeremy Corbyn, that we could see some significant gains from the Lib Dems.
Jim, Emma, anything to add?
No, I'd absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think if you look at a seat like St Albans, or look at a seat like Easter and Walton, you can certainly see how the Liberal Democrats can come from second up to first. I mean, St Albans they already have, I suppose. They've already won that seat. You can see where they're second that they're going to do okay. I think where they're not second, it might be a bit more of a challenge for them. I think it'll be localised. It'll be in some seats. There will be some kind of notable scalps. Possibly Deputy Prime Minister, for example. But whether they scale up to become that kind of third party again at the kind of same number of seats they got in 2010, that doesn't feel that likely to me.
Great, thank you, Jim. So another question, we talked a little bit about this before we went live this morning, but do the panel see any circumstances in which 2023 brings the next election? Emma, can I start with you? I think it's still
Sorry, I'm still on mute. Look, I think it's still more likely than not that the general election will take place sometime towards the end of next year. Government have until the latest the election could be held is January 25. I don't think that we'll wait that long. I think it will be towards the end of 24, sometime autumn, winter then. But do I think it's possible there could be a general election before then? Absolutely. I mean, I think we've learnt over the last couple of years in politics to never rule out anything. And we talked a bit in the earlier discussion about the kind of unruly backbenches, the really difficult, Anita outlined the really difficult kind of equation that Sunak's having to deal with. On the one hand, managing an unruly set of backbenchers who are becoming more and more unruly, and what the public need to see as they head towards an election. I think that given how unruly the backbenchers of the Conservative Party have got used to being, it's not impossible they could choose to bring down another leader, although I think it's a bit more unlikely. There are some flashpoints coming up. We've got the Northern Ireland Protocol, a really tricky area for Sunak to deal with. On the one hand, we hear a deal is close. On the other hand, we know that the EIG is likely to oppose whatever that deal looks like. That could be a real test point for how far he can get with some of the more unruly and oppositional parts of the party. I think that and a general election's unlikely, but I wouldn't rule it out.
The only thing I would add is I can't see a scenario in which we end up in a general election that is not catastrophic for the Conservatives. I don't think anyone's going to intentionally bring about an election in 2023. So on balance, pretty unlikely.
Great. So another question around net zero. It didn't feature in Sunak's 5 priorities in his speech in January, but Labour are making a big play in this area, for instance, around decarbonising power. How might the politics of net zero play out in this year and in the run up to the next election? Jim, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky question, and I saw Neil's question in the Q&A and thought I don't want to answer that. I think what's really striking is that net zero isn't featuring massively in either party's priorities. I think you're right, Neil, that Labour are making a play for it, but it doesn't feel like they've got an ambitious agenda that really answers the questions of getting to net zero by 2030. I think on the Tory side there'll be issues around costs, issues around regulation, issues around businesses having to transition incredibly quickly, households having to transition quickly, and I don't think they've laid the ground for that and for the amount of investment that's going to be needed. If you think, we're only actually kind of 5 or 6 harvest seasons away from 2030. For the food and drink industry, for example, it's going to be quite a challenge, I think, to get to the point where we'd all aimed to get to in such a limited time. Businesses, I think, are quite a lot further ahead in their readiness and their planning and in their investment than government is, and government would do well to start thinking about that. I think there's a big comms challenge, but there's a big investment challenge as well. The one thing that I'd look for from both parties in the next election on net zero is clear answers to the questions on where investment is coming from in clean power, in renewable energy, in supporting businesses and supporting households. I don't think we've had that from either party yet.
Can I say one thing? So we do a lot of work at Portland on net zero and sustainability and the broad agenda. I think that 2 things are striking. First, the public really supports net zero in general. There isn't a lot of perception that one party is particularly further ahead. It's a less divisive issue than in many other countries, not like Germany, but in the US, for instance. So I think that I'm not convinced that it's as a bigger vote mover. And I slightly worry for the Labour Party, actually, that net zero sort of becomes a bit of a big society. The thing that they hang their entire election campaign on, that's a 2015 David Cameron, 2010 David Cameron notion. The thing that they hang an election on that doesn't mean a great deal to people, and especially when you mention green jobs, a lot of voters that we found in our polling don't think, oh, someone in hard hats building a wind farm. They kind of think about people with clipboards. And I think that Labour's going to have to do more to bring to life their vision for green jobs and make people feel that it's about driving the economy. And I would say on the Conservative Party, I think that it definitely feels like in feel and in rhetoric that Sunak is not wrapped in the flag of net zero in the way that Johnson was. And I think that will matter. I actually think it may matter more because of where the Lib Dems and the Greens are. The Greens will move the Lib Dems and the Lib Dems will move, that mean that actually in the margins it could make a difference. So I think that the Conservative Party should grab some more of that ground.
Great, thank you, Anita. So final question, I think, before we're out of time, and there's been a couple of questions on this, but how damaging do you think it will be if Sunak does need to get rid of Dominic Raab in the next couple of weeks, and how can he navigate that? Emma, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I think what is damaging on the integrity question is that Sunak, rightly to his credit, when he came in as Prime Minister, promised to make this a government of integrity, to try and restore some of the kind of ethical standards that were perceived to have dropped away under his predecessors. And that was absolutely the right thing to do. I think that the challenge is it doesn't necessarily feel like that's what's happening in practice. In the last week, we've had scandals on taxes, personal financial affairs mixed up in public appointments, and now the ongoing saga around Raab. And I think, the problem is that Sunak's own approach and decision making on these issues appears to be a kind of pattern of him not acting as quickly or decisively as you might expect from a Prime Minister who's been, who's set out this aim to move beyond the years of scandals. I think on Raab, Number 10 have said, that they weren't aware of any formal allegations when he was appointed. I mean, that does leave room for the Prime Minister having been aware of informal allegations. I think that what we need to see now is a Prime Minister who is really gripping this. And I think it's much better when ethical standards appear to be emerging to try and deal with them before putting people in post, or to deal with them swiftly after investigations, once those investigations have happened. I think allowing things to kind of continue and rumble on whilst at the same time attempting to kind of claim the mantle of integrity is the most damaging and challenging thing.
I'm desperate to comment on this just because I think it's interesting. I think this comes back to my sort of problems 1, 2, and 3, right? 1 being Whitehall, 2 being backbenchers, 3 being how to win an election. And I think that Sunak couldn't have done anything else really except say, I'm going to, be integrity, accountability, and professionalism are going to be at their heart, because he had to distance himself from the chaos that kind of brought him into government. But at the same time, I do remember slightly wincing at that and thinking that's quite a high bar when you're 13 years into governing and you've got a party with lots of issues that you've inherited. And I think that I have a lot of sympathy with Sunak's approach. I have this theory that one of the reasons why we ended up leaving the European Union is because David Cameron was too hard on his backbenchers in the expenses scandal. That some of the seeds of distrust between David Cameron and his backbenchers was sown through the fact that there was a feeling he did not stand up for his MPs when the expenses scandal was happening back in 2009. And that meant that they trusted him less and less, and he had to give more and more, and then we ended up where we ended up. And I think that if Sunak had got himself into a situation of being like, I'm running against my party, I have integrity, you guys don't, I think it could end up in a situation very swiftly where MPs feel they are being thrown under the bus, and then there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. So I broadly think, given those parameters, his approach of like, I'm going to make sure things are fully investigated and MPs do not feel like they're subject to the court of public opinion, is going to help him with the management problem. Whether that helps him with the front page of the newspaper's problem, or the kind of broader public a sense of malaise around these kinds of scandals is a slightly different question.
I'm just going to quickly come back in, if that's all right. On the process point and investigations, look, I actually completely agree, Anita, and I think that one of the things we really can give Sunak credit for is that when it came to Laurie Magnus, the ethics advisor, looking into the Harvey allegations, I think that was, that was a process that actually worked exactly as it should have. You had the advisor look at what had happened, actually come to pretty swift conclusions that were based on principles rather than, focusing on the letter of the law. And then the Prime Minister acted, kind of quickly and decisively on the back of that. So I think there you do see a real shift from, what was happening under Johnson to what's happening under Sunak. And I think that is one of the positives on the ethics and kind of integrity side.
Cool. Agreed.
I think that's right. I don't think you can summarily dismiss your ministers just on the basis of allegations, and they've got to follow due process and give them a fair crack of the whip and make sure that the ministers themselves feel like they're being listened to in a way that I think Nadhim Zahawi's team and supporters felt that they weren't listened to and weren't given that due process. Arguable whether that's the case or not. But I think with, when we're talking about the Deputy Prime Minister and serious allegations of workplace bullying and so on, they have to be properly investigated before any action is taken, as much for Sunak's sake as just for the general propriety in government and how you run the ministerial code in particular. But what I would say is it's a little bit surprising that the Prime Minister hadn't heard formal or informal complaints about Raab when he was appointed, because I feel like we all had. So it was a little bit surprising that appointment was made in the first place, in my opinion.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all so much. We've reached the end of our session today, but thank you for joining us. And I've had a number of notes coming through already saying thanks for such an insightful event. There will be a recording of the webinar that's sent round to everybody and also available on our website in a few days' time. But thanks to everyone for joining us, and thank you very much to our panel.
Thank you.